independence from the state comes before any claims of reconciliation. From there, we can hopefully move forward.
Welcome to the second episode of the Global Health Uprooted podcast. In our last episode, we explored some of the challenges faced by members of the Swedish Sámi community when it comes to mental health and well-being. We discussed the role of community factors in suicide prevention, questioned the neutrality of current data collection practices, and imagined potential avenues for Sámi health research and advocacy. What lies at the root of these issues? Today's episode is our attempt at investigating some of the long-term historical forces that have shaped the current reality of the Swedish Sámi people. Our guest speaker, Åsa Össbo, is a researcher at Umeå University and an expert in the history of Swedish hydropower expansion in Sápmi. She has dedicated her career to studying the social consequences of natural resource extraction in indigenous peoples' lands. Alongside her research, she's also involved in advocacy groups aiming to raise awareness around land use and its impact on indigenous identities. We had a lovely discussion with her, and we hope you'll enjoy listening to it.
Hi, Åsa. Welcome to our podcast. It would be great if you could introduce yourself, the work you have been involved with, and what drew you to this topic.
Yes, I will. My name is Åsa Össbo, and I am a researcher working at Varto, Center for Sámi Research at Umeå University. And I'm a historian. I've been studying hydropower expansion in Sápmi. I've been interested in these issues of consequences of hydropower expansion because I myself have been I've been grown up by a regulated lake, so I know some parts of it, and in my research I have been interested in how marginalized groups have been affected by large-scale exploitation, often led by the state. So in my dissertation, I coined the concept industrial colonialism, as the Swedish state never truly have regarded itself as a colonial power. I thought that was very important to point at, that the Swedish hydropower expansion in Sápmi was a clear example of that kind of enterprise, because it involved dislocation, dispossession of land, dispossession of rights, and also loss of culture and traditional knowledge. And since indigenous peoples have a special connection to the land that they live on and off, so my hypothesis was that they must be affected on several levels, not only the material and the economic level that often is the focus from the state perspective. So after I examined how reindeer herding was affected by Swedish hydropower on a political and juridical level in my dissertation, I moved on to examine this from another angle. So in one of my recent articles, I've done an interview study. I've talked to Sámi persons that live alongside this river, the Lule River, that has had hydropower expansion for over 100 years. And I've wanted to focus on living conditions in this hydropower affected area. And one of the findings was that consequences of hydropower brought with it emotional stress and grief that also was passed on over the generations.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that really interesting, overview of your work so far.
Yeah, I was really interested about the issue of intergenerational trauma that you just mentioned. I would be super interested to hear more about how intergenerational trauma might relate to living conditions and health and mental well-being.
One thing is with this intergenerational loss, it relates to things like loss of land and loss of reindeer roots. This is on a material level, but when it comes to the younger generation today, that will never be able to experience the moving with reindeer on these old migration routes. They know that there's a large knowledge treasure that is going to be lost because they will never experience that situation, but also the fact that this particular environment could be very unsecure. You have these large unruly lakes that are regulated for hydropower, and you have these ice conditions, and the parent generation, they feared that they might transfer their own fear and worries regarding this environment. So that relates to this intergenerational experience and the intergenerational sorrow that they could feel, the younger generation. They feel their parents' losses and also their grandparents' losses.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response.
The term intergenerational sorrow was so powerful. It's not something that I've heard before. I mean, you hear about intergenerational trauma a lot, but yeah, to know that, you have to carry this burden of not being in your culture and heritage.
And also the fact that it's not recognized as such by the Swedish state, as you said, like you had to coin this new term, industrial colonialism, to put a name on this experience.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to hear, like, how did you come with such concept? Like, did it stem from your conversations with the Sámi community? Like, how do they perceive the Swedish state? And
yeah, just adding on to that, like, one of the really interesting things about Sweden is that I think globally there's this perspective that Sweden is, especially Scandinavia and Sweden, are generally super progressive, and people have this really specific idea of colonialism, which was, the British form of it.
19th century.
Yeah, but there's so many different ways in which colonialist practices are still being pursued now, especially when you consider with like the fact that this is all happening around hydro electricity, which is a renewable resource, and it's like a good way to talk about being sustainable. But how well does that actually match with the reality of what's going on?
About this, the concept industrial colonialism, it was not so very often they talked about colonialism in my source material when I wrote my dissertation. But when I've talked to Sámi persons today, colonialism is a word that is used, but it has this connotation that people are being killed. But it is also a form of genocidal action when you take away rights and lands and culture. So I think today colonialism is a word that is a concept you can use on the Swedish state's hydropower policies. I think green colonialism is often used today in the wake of this green transition, when you see all these environmental injustices that are taking place. When it comes to Sweden and Scandinavia as progressive states and regions, I think in Sweden we are still very tentative and also sometimes very ignorant about the commitments that we have towards indigenous peoples. Since we have ratified certain international conventions, and we have also recognized the Sámi as an indigenous people, the decision makers don't really realize the obligations to that recognition. So Sweden may seem as a responsible actor in the international arena, but if you turn the gaze inwards, so we have not raised any awareness about the country's own colonial actions at home. If we had done that, we would never had this debate on the Gallok mine, where reindeer herders have to prove their arguments and lay down almost 500,000 Swedish krona on investigation to prove that their arguments are right. Maybe there would be no-go zones for extractive industries decided by the Sámi parliament, and the burden of proof would of course be one way, and it would be up to the companies to prove that they are right.
No, that's very, very interesting. Especially what you mentioned about the burden of proof, like now lying on Sámi communities to prove that they belong to this land and the land belongs to them. Do you feel sometimes that a lot of bureaucracy can kind of be a form of violence in its own, forcing kind of vulnerable, marginalized communities to fight to prevent cultural, ethnic genocide? But you're making them jump through all these legal hoops and fines and all these other bureaucratic requirements. Do you think bureaucracy in some ways is kind of used as a form of violence and to kind of alienate the community and prevent, like making it harder for them to express their grievances?
Yes, I that rhymes good with one of my colleagues' concepts, extractive violence, where bureaucracy indeed could be that kind of extractive violence. Yes, and also the issue of a windmill park. The local community has to do their investigation, and often they don't have the knowledge on reindeer herding. So this is in the research I'm doing right now. We have had this past where the Sámi have been ignored in the history, but now today they are still ignored. Their voices and their perspectives are not taken into account in these decision-making processes, and that's very, very tragic, I think.
So in light of all of this, like the fact that the Sámi people have historically been ignored and like marginalized from decision processes, how does that affect the way you do research and the way you integrate Sámi voices within your work? Like, does that affect the way you view methods and how one relates to research subjects?
Yes, it does. We have this project going on right now where we have, before we started the project or before we even applied for research funding, we had conversations with different Sámi groups to see if this was an interesting project for them to participate in. So that's one part of it. I think it's very important to, in a respectful way, include Sámi organizations, Sámi individuals. So that's kind of the way we work. So, yeah.
Building on what you just said, like one thing that I found interesting while reading your articles was that I feel like you were including the Sámi worldviews within your work as well, like using some like conceptual knowledge. Like I remember this one concept of reindeer's luck, for example, like trying to incorporate their worldviews as well within your research framework.
Yes, one of the participants explicitly mentioned reindeer luck, so I had to dig into it a little bit. As I am not Indigenous myself, I can't do it all the way, but I tried, and it could be a little bit difficult, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting when speaking about research, you mentioned that you're not Indigenous yourself. When you're researching within like a marginalized community, especially asking in like interview style studies about stuff that is quite traumatic and the difference in power there is between you as a researcher, how do you approach that in your research when you're talking to someone who is affected by the Swedish state?
Yes, that's a difficult one. But in this specific interview study, I used the method yarning, where you give and take in the interview situation, so you create something together almost. So I have to give something into the conversation, give something about myself. Almost always I get into my experiences of hydropower development and of my parents, how they felt in this environment, and often we get some kind of connection in this experience that overbridge this distance that could be from a researcher to a research participant, but also the feeling that I am on their side in some way. Not that I'm going to make everything better for them, but that I'm here to listen, and I have some kind of experience that could relate to their experience. And that is in every situation you have to listen. So I think it's a very good methodology to use in these specific situations.
Yeah, that was also very insightful. I think maybe from what I understood from your answer is that ultimately it's about trying to find some common ground, and also like maintaining some humility in the conversation to be like, I'm here to listen and not to speak over.
Also this, that you can offer something of your own. You can offer, some kind of insights from my research could help with a problem in their everyday life, maybe. So if that is possible, I can do it.
I guess for the remaining of the discussion, we were quite interested to hear your thoughts about what could be the potential way forward with these issues of extractive land use and Sámi communities. So do you think that the Swedish state or big companies like Vattenfall could be somehow incentivized to take into account the Sámi communities in the way they develop and use land, or is that an idealized scenario?
It's very difficult because we are in the middle of environmental and climate crisis and catastrophe. So very great responsibility is placed on indigenous peoples to further sacrifice their land as resource grounds for the green transition. And for the state, companies and decision makers, they have to acknowledge the history and the ongoing consequences before they go further with the green transition. I hope that the Sámi Truth Commission will actually take a broad and deep approach in this issue, so that the actions of decision makers and authorities are made visible, and that penance from the state comes before any claims of reconciliation. From there, we can hopefully move forward when it is obvious for all Swedish inhabitants what the Sámi society has been forced to forfeit, not only during the last 100 years, but possibly also further back in history. So this has to be undisputable, where indigenous history, the Sámi history, will not be ignored.
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting that you mentioned this idea that Sámi people have to, sacrifice their land and resources to further some common good cause of going towards sustainability, when ironically, a lot of the indigenous practices, and I'm sure were already more sustainable in many ways, and through, because of being colonized and being divorced from their heritage and tradition, they are forced to give up those sustainable practices and then instead give up their land to practice what is a Swedish form of sustainability that is not accepted, that when the Sámi form is not accepted by the state. And that's quite ironic and painful.
Yeah, the fact that they're forced to give up the migration route and transport the reindeers by road traffic instead of doing the transition by foot as they used to is like quite a telling example of sirens.
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, if the Swedish state doesn't fund any sustainable practice development within reindeer herding, how are they supposed to do that then? Because they are supporting that kind of strategies within farming and forestry. But how about the reindeer herding? They are supposed to be sustainable by definition, but they have to have their resources to do that as well.
Yeah, I guess, asking people to change behavior without giving them the opportunity and the resources to be able to do that is quite illogical and a very unrealistic expectation. Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering what would be your thoughts on the idea of like compensation and reparation. Like, how could we not make up for, but at least like recognize and pave the way forward for like all these loss that was inflicted on the Sámi people?
Is there a way?
I was just thinking about, it's not possible to compensate for certain things. The only way you can take this wind power park or industry in Norway, decided that one wind power park is illegal, and now the reindeer herders awaits the deconstruction of these windmills. But will that be done? That would be the only reparation that the reindeer herders could get. The reindeer can't eat money. That's an oldie. And they have to have their lands to tend reindeer on. So how is compensation possible? Only if the future will bring stronger rights and more self-determination, and also no more extractive industry projects. But that kind of decision has to be built on Truth Commission statement that the sacrifice is gone too far. They have to have their lands for themselves. So maybe that's a possible compensation. But you can't compensate for the things that is taken.
Yeah, priceless, I guess.
Priceless, yeah.
Yeah, you can't really put any sort of value on that. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's my view. Maybe the Sámi community has another. And another thing is also that many of the Sámi lives in the interior of northern Sweden, society communities that have very low levels of social services and things like that. So that could also be some kind of compensation to really have equal living standards to the majority population.
Even if there is no clear answer to the question, I think it's always good to ask, what can be done. And obviously, ultimately, the answer has to come from the Sámi community and what they believe and wish for. I think there's no really room for a lot of negotiation from the state in terms of what they should provide. And obviously, the Sámi community itself is not like a monolith, so there may be a lot of divergence in opinion within the community.
Younger and older generations also.
Yeah, they may want different things, and maybe for some people the future is more important, but for other people maybe compensating for the past is also equally important. But yeah, these are very interesting things to think about. Thank you so much for your conversation so far. Just before we leave, are there any final messages that you want to send, or is there something that you want to say that you haven't been able to say yet?
Maybe if you want to tell us a few words about like the current or next research project that you will be working on, or like.
Yes, in my current research, I try to get hold of both the history of energy production in Sápmi and the company, how they have acted and how they act today, because several of my research participants have pointed at this great reconciliation work that Vattenfall has to do with both Sámi and other persons that live in the northern parts of Sweden. So that's one thing I want to underline, that the state company Vattenfall has great work ahead of them, and I hope they are involved in some way in this Truth Commission the Sámi Truth Commission. But I don't know if they are, but I think that would be a very nice way to include the different tentacles of the colonial power that has had a very great impact on Sámi life.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a really interesting conversation. Yeah, thank you so much for your insights into your research, and yeah.